Welcome back, folks. Professor Way here, Jonathan Historian, part 2. We're going to continue the nationalism in Eastern Europe and towards the origins of the First World War. A lot to cover here. There's a lot of history in Eastern Europe, and one thing that I do specialize in honored in Eastern European history, particularly Russian history, but it was pretty much all Eastern European studies. Love it. What happens in Eastern Europe? Eastern Europe was always the concept of on the back waters, right? On the fringes, on the crystallites of society. And that's one thing I just loved about it. But it's the stuff that we don't really know, right? But there's a lot to it. This is part 2, and we're going to get right into the Serbian Revolution. Now, at the time, within the Balkans, especially after, we're talking about after the year of 1848 or the springtime of nations. You don't see this kind of activity too much in Europe today. There's a lot of the stuff actually going on in the world, but people are just don't really give a fuck. That's lack of, pardon my Russian, but that's pretty much what it is. People just don't care. They're mostly concerned with their own lives, but at the same time, all of this is affecting us. Same as the war with Trump, Israel, and the States against Iran right now. It's entirely infecting the entire globe. The same as when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. 4 years this war has been going on, and in the whole 4 years, I have not done anything on it because it's a very hot topic of discussion among people. Everyone's pro-Ukraine. Well, I ain't pro-Ukraine. I am pro-Russian. Everything that's coming into Ukraine, even into Russia, all the bad that's coming out of both, Ukraine still outweighs what's coming into Russia right now. So, but I am going to do a series on it, I believe, this summer. I'm going to finally say screw it, and now we're going to do a series on it. We're going to look at the history of why I am pro-Russian, but on the fact of that war and why Russia's doing what it's doing, and it has right reason to do so. But there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of archaeological and documental evidence to support why Russia's doing what it's doing, and besides its history, it's built into its social DNA. But anyways, we're going to get back into nationalism. Oh, buddy. Now, one thing I loved about the fact is that everything that's going on in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which is a famous empire, but it's like the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was just like, it was just there. It really had no oomph, if you wanted to put it. It had no spunk. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire, it was kind of like that. It was just an entity that had to be put together just to hold its imperial might for the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs is the only one of the reasons why they wanted to hold this together, because they owned all this territory and all these subjects. But the problem with nationalism is you're putting a leprosy within the empire. So, for the Czechs, for instance, if you took the Czechs that were actually within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, now, within Bohemia, for instance, in the region, especially during time of German unification process in the Bismarck Wars of unification that we discussed a while back, the Czechs had a lot of similarity with the Germans, but they resisted the idea of German domination. They didn't want to be, they felt German kind of thing. Language is similar, every culture is a little similar, but they didn't really felt like they were going to be treated right. And that's why you have the Czech Republic today, or at one time was Czechoslovakia, 2 countries into one. Now it's the Czech Republic, or Czechia, which they want to call themselves now. So, either or, they're still the Czech people. And they wanted the Czech language to actually be equal with German. And that wasn't going to be allowed, especially not within the German Reich. You're German, you're German. There's not going to be no special rights here. Everybody in Germany is going to be German. So the Czechs are sitting there thinking, oh crap, that's great. So we got some Czechs in the German Empire, so their second language becomes Czech, despite that they're Czech. So, And then you got within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire the same aspects. So it's amazing how this actually all works. Now, we left off as the Southern Slavs. The Southern Slavs are the ones that really are politically targeted, especially for Pan-Slavism. And the idea of it is really monumental, especially for Russia. For the Russian Empire, it is great. We're Slavs, you're Slavs, we're all Slavs. Let's Slav it up. And that's what they wanted to do. And the best way to break away an empire is infiltrate, right? Same thing goes for anything, like friendships, colleagues, anything. If you put a wedge between two people, yeah, right? They're fighting each other, but you're like, yeah, I'm sitting here just watching the show. Well, same thing, even on a bigger scale. But Russia's going to be that wedge, especially with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, as well as the Ottomans. So they're putting Pan-Slavism as that wedge between them. Now, the Serbian Revolution, and it is a revolution, they usually have two. Well, they don't usually have two. It's not like they have it every couple of years, but they have two. So this kind of refers to the national uprising, which pretty much takes place from 1804 and finally wraps up about 1835. And this is a very interesting revolution when you study revolutions itself. There's a lot to it. There's books on it, there's articles, there's documentaries. There's a lot on this revolution. But this revolution is actually the start of what's going to happen on June the 28th, 1914. And this happens well over 100 years before the event. So every action has a reaction. Well, there's going to be a lot of reactions and actions to those reactions all the way up to them. It's a domino effect. We live in a world today that, like Billy Joel said, we didn't start the fire. What are we trying to do? Just put it out. Right? Next generation's going to try to do the same with our mistakes. We'll have our accomplishments, but we'll have our mistakes, but the next generation's going to have to put those fires out. Sometimes it takes generations and generations to put that fire out. That's just the reality of it. It's life. It's the entire evolution of civilization and humanity. This is what we do. It's not what we're on this earth to do. Some people like to believe that, but not really. Alright? So for the Serbs, their main focus, especially in 1805 or 1804 to 1835, was pretty much to throw the yoke off of the Ottoman authorities, the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to end Ottoman rule over the Serbian people. Now, the Serbs were very... now, after centuries of Janissary program and policy, and it created one of the greatest armies the world has ever seen, was the Janissary army. You've got to remember the Prussians came down to Istanbul and asked and trained and developed their army with the Janissaries and took that back to Prussia. That's why Prussia becomes this massive military unit. It is because of that past. So you got to think the Janissaries were the greatest army the world has ever seen. All right, they were like the Assyrians during ancient times. They were like the Spartans in Greece through the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, so there's so many examples. This is how it happened. And this is with the Janissaries, right? Remember, pretty interesting fact that the Prussians actually went down there and trained with them and to learn their tactics, strategies, discipline, everything. Even their morality, they took it back. The importance of it. So it's really, really cool that way. Alright? Now, it doesn't become official until after the Congress of Berlin, when the Ottoman Empire actually recognizes the sovereignty of Serbia. But Serbia then is not a thorn by this time in the Ottoman side. It switches to the Austrian-Hungarians. Well, beating around the bush here, boys. Now, the first uprising is pretty much 1804 to 1813. And the second is 1815 to pretty much 1835. So you have these two massive revolutions. And the Ottomans have a tremendous force compared to what Serbia could muster up. But the Ottomans, compared to the Russians or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they didn't have a match. They weren't a match at all at this point in time. So it's pretty, you know. So pretty much the Serbian Revolution is encouraged by two things. Nationalism. Zabrina, that's the one we're talking about. The other one is actually Russian encouragement because of Pan-Slavism ideas over the decades during the 19th century. And it's amazing how these two work, because Serbia becomes the new Russia of the Balkans. If you take even during the whole Kosovo and Bosnian war in our lifetime growing up, you've seen a lot of that, right? You've seen the genocides, everything that happened in the Balkans. The Balkans have always been an area where shit accumulates, all right, in lack of better terms, and it doesn't, and it always explodes, right? At some point, a lot of wars have actually came and started out of the Balkans. The First World War, you know, there's a lot with Serbia. Serbia's pretty cool. All right. So when Serbia does become independent, Belgrade is its capital. The last major thing to actually hit Serbia, and we have to go back to about 1389 at the Battle of Black Fields, Black Rose, to get to the idea of why Kosovo separated from Serbia. This was a huge thing. I was anti-Kosovo. I was for Serbia. I was like, this makes no sense why Kosovo's doing this. It does make sense at the time in our lifetime, but that's where nationalism really became a factor within Serbia itself. And it's a very important lesson, because we also see it in our country, Canada. Think about nationalism and you apply it to Quebec. Right now you have Alberta. Alberta's a little different case. It's mostly nationalism likes to shine its face for economics. And we have seen that with the Germans. Remember the first German unification of the northern German states under economic, a very strong economic reasoning and to unite. And then they want the political aspect of it. Well, it's the same thing in a lot of ways, because with Alberta, it's like, will they gain separation? Well, the major key is a lot of things in the New World is one thing is Aboriginal rights and treaties that were assigned and should be upheld. That's where it's becoming very difficult. But the problem is the rest of the world is coming here, and the rest of the world don't care. So, not like the ones that were born, raised, and came from settlers, like my family. So, from way down the line, 8 generations now. So, we built the nation, the world that we live in today. So, in this part of the world, but we'll see. Now, the first uprising was pretty much led by Petrovic. Okay, now this guy is a very interesting guy because he crushes the Ottomans on the battlefield. He strategically does it very well, and he doesn't really hold back. Okay, until the second uprising in 1815. This is when you get the next major feature, the father of modern day Serbia. The guy, this guy's, this guy is a part of Serbian nationalism, and everybody in Serbia knows this guy historically. All right, so Obinovic. Okay, now Obinovic was pretty much one of the most interesting guys. He secured semi-independence from Serbia from the Ottoman Empire. He becomes pretty much the father of the modern Serbian nation. And also, that's also brought up a lot in the Bosnian Wars in the 90s. So, oh yes. It's funny how the past can come back to haunt you. It doesn't really come back to haunt, but sometimes it comes back to remind you, hey, hello, remember this? We don't want to do this again. Oh, we don't? Oh, crap. Well, we're going to anyway. In the case of that. So everyone has their, and they're so prideful of that. You know, they're prideful of their mistakes. They're prideful of their accomplishments. In Serbia, Serbia is like the modern, small, miniature Russia. I like to call it is the little brother of Russia. Russia will always support Serbia to the end of time. It would take a really big wedge between those two, the big brother and the small brother, to even today. People tried, even America's tried, NATO has tried, a lot of people have tried and failed. The only way a wedge is going to become between those two is basically if it's internal. Okay, and it has, but it has failed. It has failed. Now, as you know, pretty much Serbia is not totally recognized for its independence until 1878, and this is when the Ottoman, at the Congress of Berlin, this is where the Ottomans actually recognize it. They lost that territory. They gave it up. They're like, you know what? Man, this has been going on for decades, generations. We recognize Serbian independence. Huge. Okay? It was not like the Greeks. The Greeks came faster, but for Serbia, they didn't want to lose Serbia. But they did. Serbia fought very hard. To David and Goliath, 100% episode. It was phenomenal. Okay? But they finally won it. And when they did finally win it, and they achieved full international recognition to become as an independent nation, Serbia was born, and everything was falling into place. But this is when Serbia, when it becomes an independent nation, it's not a thorn now in the Ottoman side. The Ottomans cut the umbilical cord. All right, they cut the cord. All right, don't be another casualty. Cut the cord. Famous song. Cut the cord. Well, guess what? This cord was cut, but then it latched onto the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The next major feature, and then the Austrians were like, "What the? Uh-oh, what are we going to do here?" All right, now that's going to come back. All right, now you got to think for the Ottomans, 1805, very important year in the Ottoman history. Now, we witnessed back a couple episodes when we did the Greek War of Independence, where the Egyptians showed up with the navy, and the Russians demolished it. But anyway, a huge naval battle. Remember that naval battle? Started with L. I'll give you that. Alright, I'm not going to give you anything. Should have watched the episodes. But, pretty much in 1805, in the sense of the Egyptians, Muhammad Ali. This is a Muhammad Ali. Okay, Ali. Okay? Not the Muhammad Ali, the boxer. This is the other guy before the boxer. Alright? He made Egypt virtually independent from the Ottoman Empire and from the Sultan. Took Egypt right out of the Ottoman Empire. It was its own nation. It was its own kind of caliphate, sulfate kind of concept. So it became its own polity. And the thing was, by 1829, as you recall, when they became allies with the Ottomans, we broke away from you, but we're still allies. This is where the Muslim connection comes in greatly. Alright? So the Greeks are rebelling, and this is the War of Greek Independence happening at this time. After, alright? Especially in 1929, or 1829, sorry. So you gotta think for a second. So they send the Navy to help them. The Egyptian Navy, which was pretty much the original good chunk of the Ottoman Navy, came out of Alexandria, sailed up, got demolished by the Russians, the British, and the French, and just decimated in the Battle of Lapdino, right? And so, now, at this time, Serbia became that set, right? That was the sense of nationalism there. And when this happened, at the exact same time, Serbia starts to become a thorn, more like a boil on the Austrian-Hungarian ass. No matter where they sit, Serbia's there. They feel it, and it hurts. Alright, there's no ointment to make this go away. Well, there is, but it's very aggressive ointment. Ouch. Okay, so you have all that. And because in 1830, right up until 1882, Serbia is a huge pain in the ass and a view in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as much as the Ottomans. But the Ottomans finally released that after 1878. They recognized it in front of the entire European powers at the Congress of Berlin. Free from the shackles, free from the persecution, free from the influence, and free from the threat currently at that time in 1878. But the threat was going to come back. Alright? The threat was going to come back. Now, what was going on in the Ottoman Empire? Ottomanism is actually a term. Now, you don't really learn it in high school. It's something that, it's like Pan-Slavism. You do kind of cover Pan-Slavism in high school. But within the Ottoman Empire, which is known for being the sick man of Europe, it was a dying empire. And the Austrians and even the Russians, you have to recall and remember this, they wanted to claim territory and gain prestige and fulfill their geographical positioning and their geopolitics militarily, politically, to conquer more territory at the expense of the Ottoman regime. So, well, the Ottoman Empire, wouldn't say regime. So something starts to happen. Ottomanism. Alright? Which was pretty much a bunch of intellects, promotes the share of Ottoman identity. They wanted to do almost exactly what happened in 1867 with the Austro-Hungarian Empire to keep it together. Well, the sense of an Ottoman identity to keep the Ottoman Empire together, despite all the facts of all the nationalisms that they were ruling over. The Israelites, Palestinians, Syrians, Arabs, Turks, Ottomans, well, not Ottomans, Armenians, Kurds, Egyptians, but they left after 1805. So that was kind of too late for that. So there is this thing. Just to grant, so what they did with this was they granted equal rights to all the ethnics of the empire. But this largely failed. It was a little too late. Nationalism penetrated the Ottoman Empire on such a level, just like the Russians we're going to learn, and just as we just know of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It penetrated it so much there was no cure. They tried every treatment. Medically, it was on the verge of going flatline, but it was barely holding on. Powers of Britain and France, in some degree Russia, in some degree, tried to keep the Ottoman Empire on life support, just to keep it breathing. By this point, it's in a coma. That's how I look. This is how you can look at it. It was in a coma. It was just on life support. It was getting tube fed. It was barely hanging on. It was barely going in and out of consciousness on the bed, on the hospital bed. Right? There's not much time left for the Ottoman Empire, but everybody had, France and Britain had to keep this empire together because they had to keep the Russians at bay. And this actually helped, believe it or not. But what do you do? Right? What do you do? Now, in the Balkans, a lot of that sickness or that nationalism, that leprosy to an empire revealed itself. Like the Greeks, the Serbs, the Romanians, the Bulgarians are showing up. Alright? They're all starting to gain their independence from the Ottoman Empire. Where you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire looking at this as possible small countries that they could easily devour. And for the Russians, heavily influenced over these to not to military conquer them, but to put them in politically, alright? And to have sponsorship in those countries, which Russia still does today. It's a tactic. America does it. A lot of the superpowers of the world actually do this tactic. Especially during the Cold War, right? Especially even before then. Way before then. Even in ancient times, they did this. They would send people in to, yeah, pro. And I'm not pro-Russian because Russia didn't pay me to say this stuff. I'm actually born Canadian and go pro-Russian. So I'm not getting paid for this. Alright? So you got to think about this. There's a huge wave of national awakenings. Okay, let's put it this way. This is the age in the Balkans of national awakenings. And with a lot of interventions and wars that actually took place by the European powers. If you took, let's just take the Greeks. They were the first to establish a full independent state within the Balkans. Okay? After a long rebellion that started in 1821 and finally ended in 1830, 1829, 1830. They were the first. And then you have Serbia that fought before that uprisings towards their independence. All right. The first one is 1804 to 1815. The second one is finally right up, constant war up until 1878. Right. So then you have the ones that we don't remember of, the Romanians. Right. So the Romanians, well, they were under the principalities, and Romania finally gained its independence in pretty much 1975 or 1875 from the Ottomans. And they did it very well. And they did it very well. But the problem is they fought along the side because they gained it at the expense of helping Russia in pretty much the Russian-Turkish War, the really famous one, 1870 to 1878. This is how Romania gains its independence. Because Slavic brothers are helping Slavic brothers. Cheers. Right? So Russia gets a little bit of land. Romania becomes an independent nation, great ally. At the same time, if Russia needed to, they could plow them over. But they didn't, due to a lot of things. Then you go further south and you get the Bulgarians. Well, the Bulgarians really never had an autonomous principality pretty much until 1878, after the Congress of Vienna, because the Russo-Turkish War established so many independent nations within the Balkans. It took war between Russia and the Ottomans for a lot of these nations to be fully recognized by other European powers and even by the Ottomans themselves. Serbia was one, as you recall. So also that year, the Bulgarians finally gained their full independence. Well, they don't gain it 100% full independence until about 1908. It's kind of funny you're going to think of 1908. They finally become a nation, and they get semi-independence and equality between them up until that point. But nationalism has a really strong hold on the Bulgarians. Bulgarians are very prideful people being Bulgarian. You know, you have Basil the Bulgarian Slayer. Ooh, they went against him, right? He's out of the picture. But the Bulgarians eventually follow a long national rivalry with Russia. They do go to war with Russia for a little bit. They lose, but Russia recognizes them eventually to become an independent state. Now, take one of the most interesting examples in the Balkans would actually be the Albanians. They finally get their independence about 1812, fully independent from the Ottoman Empire. Now, Albania is this miniature Ottoman Empire within the Balkans. They're fully Muslim, totally surrounded by a Christianity world, Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox. But you have this small enclave, Albania, dedicated to Islam. Okay? Even today, their national religion is Muslim. It's Islam. So, it's interesting how they developed. Alright? They were finally endorsed by the great European powers by 1913, just before the war happened. But it's an interesting country, and you're going to see later on why Benito Mussolini wants to conquer Albania first when it steps into, well, I mean, to the fascist regime, it seemed like a little step stool that they could just push over on their way to Greece and rebuild the new Roman Empire. Well, Benito Mussolini had a little too much meatballs in his salad, if you know what I mean, to get that right. So he couldn't really do it. All right. So, and there's other nations, the Mongolians, as well. They established in 1813. All these places just come about before and finally recognized, and it's because of war and intervention by the great European powers that all these nations actually become recognized. And it's all becomes out of the Serbian Revolution and nationalism's involvement, because with the Greeks and the Serbs, they were the first two major ones to usher in the rest of them, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Macedonians, the Albanians, to actually say, we want to get finally rid of Ottoman domination, right? If you have a bunch of people in a room, let's say you had 10 people in a room. Now, you told them all before you go in the room, everybody stay quiet. In time, there's going to be one person that's going to break that. It only takes one. Someone's going to say, why do we got to be silent? What is the point of this? Why are we here? Someone's going to break the silence. And the rest of them are all going to start talking. Well, that one that broke the silence and broke the Ottoman back, well, that was going to be Serbian Greece. Right? They're kind of nick to nick. But the Greeks were really the ones to issue it. They built the cake. Serbia just put the icing and the cherry on top and got the rest of them on board. What happened in Egypt, no one really cared in 1805. You know, despite they broke away from the Ottoman Empire. Congrats, right? No one really cared because it was just another Muslim aspect. Now, the problem with all this nationalism that was building is one of my favorite wars took place. It starts to happen, which we're going to discuss later on. Is the Balkan Wars. And pretty much 1812, there's two Balkan Wars, 1812 to 1813. And just before 1914, or 1912, 1913, just before 1914, it is the miniature war. And this is where I'm looking at the Balkans. I want you to keep this in valley. A little Russia, little Ottomans. You're going to see where the other ones fit in, okay? Okay, with the Greeks, you could say they're like almost like the British, French. It's like a miniature Europe happening in the Balkans. And when the Balkan Wars actually break out, the first one breaks out in, 1912, it's kind of a miniature prelude of what's going to take place on a bigger scale. Alright? It's only on a little high school theater, but it is going to go to the big theater of Carnegie Hall. And that's going to be the whole world. It's going to the it's going to the boardwalk. It's going to the Broadway. Alright? So, it's kind of interesting how it mimics. Okay, that's why throughout history too, there's a lot of small wars that imitate a foreshadowing of what's to come. A bigger event. Now, I want you to think right now, currently, we're going to stop there before we get on how the next episode we're going to talk about how this nationalism actually starts to more than fuel within the Ottomans, and then we're going to get into the Russians in the next episode. But we're going to little thought on this at the end of this one. How do you think the events of the world that are taking place right now that you know of have anything? There's little wars that took place, and the wars are getting bigger. Now, I'm not saying there's going to be a World War III. If there is, that's the end of us all. That will be the Antichrist. Christ is going to come back. We're going to get out of here for the second coming, because I really don't want to stick around for that. So I'd rather go to paradise and go to vacation and enjoy myself, kick up my feet, and have a great old conversation with Jesus on this one. So I'm not sticking around for this. If you want to stick around for misery, go to her. But I wouldn't. But I'm not saying that's going to be. Now, there's a lot of the last couple of years, even when Russia invaded Ukraine, all this, people talk about blah, 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 it's going to start World War III. No. Here's the problem. Those people just don't know history. History itself foreshadows things to come, but there's really no indication of any certain event that is sparking anything in the future for World War III in our lifetime. not like the other ones. Now, this might set it up for the next century, right? It took about 150 years to set up World War One. World War One set up World War Two, just a couple decades. They kind of learned from that, but because of World War Two and because of the aspects and the causes after World War Two, it sets up what's going on in the Middle East from then until today. But eventually, it's going to have a breaking point that there's going to be a major war. Right? Just how the only thing that anybody can't predict is when. It will happen, but when? You know, it's like, is it going to be a 2-minute climax or is it going to be a 5-minute climax? It's coming, but you don't know when. So you'll feel it when it gets there, right? So for the next one, we're going to talk about how nationalism fueled the wars of the Balkans, but we might actually not do right into the Balkan Wars yet, but we might a little bit before we get into the Russian Empire. We're going to talk more about actually the Ottoman Empire in the next episode. And we're going to put a freeze on that, if you can recall. So until next time, this is John the Historian. Remember, you are a product of what you are today because of your past. So therefore, you can change your future.